to dug up inside the earth little holes like foxholes. And the whole family, sometimes of 6, lived in this earth house.
In the two aggressor nations which had begun the war, the future looked extremely uncertain.
Germany was defeated, and it was going to be cut right in half. And Japan had been, just as in Churchill's phrase, ground powder. And in that, we'd been brought kicking and screaming to the zenith of our power.
With troops now stationed in 20 countries around the world, America's historic isolationism was over. "400,000 GIs were sent to occupy Japan. They were under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, one of the architects of the Japanese defeat. The Japanese were allowed to keep their emperor, Hirohito, but absolute imperial rule was over. The United States wrote a new Japanese constitution. In Japan, America was the sole occupying force. In Europe, it was America and the Soviet Union. And this ideological struggle between them would be played out on a continent beset by chaos.
I made my way eventually through Mannheim, where I was born. And as I made my way through Germany, I realized the total destruction that had taken place in that country. Displaced persons walking all over, from the east to the west, from the west to the east. Large cities bombed out, ruins.
In the homeland of the once powerful and terrifying Third Reich, people now battled one another on the streets for bread.
There was absolutely nothing to eat, so they rummaged in garbage cans. If I think of my father rummaging in garbage cans, it's terrible.
People without jobs, people without homes, children without parents. It was a nightmare. It was hideous. And one of the coldest winters on record came down on Europe.
There are a lot of children who didn't have any Christmas. We had a big Christmas party for them. I played Santa Claus. I remember bringing those little kids up and sitting them on my lap, and the happy faces and the smiles, very rewarding.
The only real force was the Allied military government. That was the power. The country had come to a standstill. There was total anarchy in this country.
And throughout Western Europe, deprivation and devastation were causing political turmoil. In America, there was concern that this chaos would somehow encourage Western Europeans to turn to the communists.
It seemed as though, in a way, they had a lot of the cards. Wherever there was misery and poverty, where could people turn but to communism? Capitalism, don't forget, hadn't looked too good in the 30s. A lot of people had thought it was played out. There was a sense that Italy might topple the next election, even France. There was a definite momentum, it seemed to me, in favor of the Red Menace.
The political leadership in the United States, for its part, saw the wisdom in getting Europe back on its feet. In an act of unprecedented generosity, America sent $13 billion in aid.
The United States is the only country in the world today which has the economic power and productivity to furnish the needed assistance.
The Marshall Plan, named after the Secretary of State, seemed the perfect merger of American ideals and good politics.
America was a strong, generous country. It is fashionable to make fun of it, but it really was true, and we were rich, and we were confident, and we were sympathetic to the devastation of Europe and what we could do. The Russians were very, very harsh. Where we were sending in stuff to Western Europe, they were stripping down Eastern Europe and mailing and railroading everything back east.
As the Soviets tightened their hold on the captive nations of Eastern Europe, those who could escape did. Alice Sylvester and her family had survived the Nazi death camps and made their way home to Czechoslovakia.
There was a Russian doctor, and he said, "My child, I love my country, but the Russians are going to overtake here. So my advice to you is go, run." So my mother and I, during the night, went to the railway station, and we got on a train, and we got out. And the next morning they closed the borders, so the people that stayed couldn't get out.
Churchill had been right. Those people now trapped behind the Iron Curtain would be subject to Soviet exploitation and repression for the next 4 decades. Berlin had lived through a nightmare, and at the end of World War II, the landscape reflected it. The fighting here had been particularly vicious. On the Eastern Front, the Germans had fought to the bitter end. The Soviet army had suffered 500,000 casualties before the German capital fell.
The Russian soldiers, they were intoxicated by blood, by cruelty, and it was with the memories of what Germans did to their mothers and sisters and daughters, they wanted to do the same. There was huge loot, burning down of houses, rape.
Soviet troops raped thousands of women.
My mother was raped, gang raped, by the Russians, and my friend, she was raped. Her father was still alive. They put him in a corner and said, "You stand there and you count the rapes on your daughter." So all the 32 Russians raped her, and the father had to count out loud, 1, 2, and so forth. That's why I know it was 32.
The Russians were very brutal. The Germans, they sure hated the Russians, though, and they had a reason. The Russians behaved themselves miserably here.
Several months later, the Western Allies arrived. One of the first U.S. missions into post-war Berlin was flown by Jack Olin Bennett.
So we landed, and then the Russians started to lob shells over my head, shooting the windows out of the airport with artillery shells. Why the hell are the Russians shooting the windows out of this magnificent airport? Then I thought, this is going to be the American sector, and they don't want to leave the Americans anything.
Located deep inside what was now Soviet-controlled East Germany, Berlin would be divided into Soviet, American, British, and French sectors. Stalin resented this democratic outpost in Eastern Europe. This was intended as his buffer zone against any future attack from the West.
Stalin presented his image of the countries on the other side of the Iron Curtain. These countries want to subjugate Russia with its immense mineral wealth. They are natural enemies of the socialist and communist state.
The first face-to-face confrontation of the Cold War was in Berlin. Stalin was determined that the Western Allies should leave, and in June of 1948, he cut all the supply lines into the Allied sectors.
It was very tense, and we knew that, and it got tenser and tenser.
West Berliners had enough food to last a few weeks, enough fuel to last only days.
Truman said in meetings in the Oval Office, and he meant it, we stay in Berlin.
You live with the expectation, I did, that we would be going to war with Russia.
The United States were painted and depicted by official propaganda as the greatest enemy, ready at any hour to drop atomic bomb on Russia.
We were close to a Third World War. There were some who were arguing we should leave. It isn't worth it. Get out. Why start a Third World War over this city? Others were saying we should send an armored division through and break through by force.
President Truman chose another option. He would supply the beleaguered city by air. It was a gamble. American and British pilots who had once dropped bombs on this city would deliver supplies to Berlin hour after hour, day after day.
We were so busy during the airlift. I was flying 128 hours a month. It's a lot of flying. And we were keeping people alive.
They flew in food and fuel and medicine. They were the lifeline for 2.5 million Berliners. After 11 months, Stalin conceded. Without saying a word, he ended the blockade in May of 1949. 3 months later, Stalin would shock the West again.
Once we knew the Soviets had the atomic bomb in 1949, it then became, once again, a different world.
Now, we could be a target of an atomic attack and did not trust the Russians. And I do remember this, that you always lived day to day with the thought that there could be a nuclear attack on us at any time.
In only 3 years, Americans had gone from buying their first homes to building their first bomb shelters.
And I physically dug out an area underneath that house, right at 6 foot deep, so that the family could at least go there and be below ground level.
The United States would suffer another shock when, on October the 1st, 1949, they learned that Mao Zedong's communists had defeated the American-backed nationalist forces in China.
The communists under Mao touched something very deep in the peasantry, fought a brilliant fight. You have the Russians getting the atomic weapon, China has fallen. There's no doubt that there was a sense in many quarters that we were in a titanic struggle.
The struggle erupted on June the 25th, 1950, when North Korea, supported by both the Soviet Union and China, attacked the South. An American-led army under the auspices of the newly formed United Nations was rushed in to resist them.
The free nations have now made it clear that lawless aggression will be met with force.
So once again, a wartime draft interrupted American lives. Men were torn from their families and sent to the other side of the world. World War II vet Len Mattioli had been enjoying the sun-baked California good life. By November of 1950, he was fighting North Korean and Communist Chinese soldiers at Korea's Chosin Reservoir.
The Chinese were all over us. We just mowed them down. And it was just hard to believe that they would just keep coming like that. And we had an awful lot of dead and dying. It dropped between 20 and 40 degrees below zero at times. It got so cold the treads